Okay, I think we're ready to start the second session. We have 4 speakers. To open this presentation, Professor Philomena Murray, who's the Monnet Professor in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Melbourne, is going to present on the EU's engagement with Australia, the development of a de facto strategic partnership.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just briefly talk to you about the dimensions of the EU-Australia relationship. I'm going to look at 3. I'm going to look at what is a strategic partnership, and I'm taking 3 points. I'm going to try and look at what makes it effective. I was thinking 3 points might be a good way to go there too. And then what partnership is actually developing between Australia and the EU, and I will talk about a problem called the triple hierarchy, or I think that's what it's called. I think one of the major issues for the European Union has been its focus on a single policy, and this has been really difficult in terms of the relationship between Australia and the EU. Australia never had anything against these particular cows from the south of Belgium, but rather on the common agricultural policy. Both Andrea and I have talked about this in our joint work as well as in separate work, and I know that Ed is going to talk about it. The second issue is this focus on the single country, the UK. That may well be our future Governor-General there on the right. And so what we had was this sense that, in a sense, the European Union was seen through what I call the Kapuk factor, the Common Agricultural Policy, UK. And this set of prisms, I think, hasn't been tremendously useful, but I don't need to go through that now. Many of you are aware of it. So I'm going to lead on to my close encounter of the third kind, and that is the third dimension, where now the negotiations have certainly been much more fruitful than in the past. They've developed in terms of trade. There's also been a multilateralization of the trade relationship in many ways, particularly since the Uruguay round, but also in the context of the partnership framework of 2008. There's also the aspect of the European Union as a normative actor, and one of the speakers here from the audience talked about the issue of human rights, and that this is where you see the European Union and Australia do indeed have a shared sense of commitment to governance issues in the Asia-Pacific context. That brings me to my third point, and that is about the regional context, that there is now more of a regional context rather than simply a bilateral one in the way the European Union and Australia deal with each other, with a commitment to effective multilateralism, to use the EU parlance in this case, but also to a regional case, whether it's humanitarian assistance, development assistance, or indeed a shared concern about governance issues in the region as well as China. There are also ideational factors in the relationship, common concerns, which Andrea Nicolai has already mentioned, the idea of common issues which they can also work together on, to a certain extent common values. I would suggest that we need to consider to what extent there is a close alignment here. Certainly leadership changes on the Australian side have led to an opening up, and this has already been mentioned before, particularly from the Rudd and Gillard-led governments. And when I talk about leadership change, I'm talking about changes in government. I'm not talking about any particular plots that may be taking place today or any other day about the current Prime Minister of Australia. And lastly, that their power and realist concerns are very important too, and that is the different changing power balances, but also the issue of balancing in the Asia-Pacific has become much more important. That means that now you have two hegemons at least in the Asia-Pacific region. You have the external hegemon, the United States, and you've got the regional hegemon, China. Each of the interlocutors, the EU and Australia, engage with each of these hegemons, sometimes in complementary ways and sometimes not. But nevertheless, it's worth mentioning that they both have concerns about these issues and about their relationship and developing their relationship. The Australian government has chosen, for instance, to deepen its relationship with the United States in terms of cooperation, for instance, with their military forces in Darwin, for example, whereas the United States and the EU signed a common Asia-Pacific document last year, an agreement on their concerns about their region. So how do we define a strategic partnership? I was hoping I'd have the framework agreement, which Andrea and his colleagues haven't got around to signing, and David and his colleagues haven't got around to signing yet. And I was hoping to use the framework agreement, which we hope will be signed sometime in the next few months, and examine it through the prism of a strategic partnership. Well, what is a strategic partnership? Well, one EU diplomat said it's like love, no one can define it. You can only know it when you experience it. I'm not so sure I found that very helpful. Then others have written about how partnerships, such as Giovanni Grevi, partnerships are strategic when they actually have objectives that go beyond bilateral issues. And this has already been partly touched on today. And I think that regional and multilateral aspect to many relationships that the European Union has do add a strategic dimension. And indeed, it's to work together to foster international cooperation. Whether the relationship between Australia and the European Union is in fact a strategic partnership in anything but name, we won't really be able to assess that fully, but I'm suggesting to you that there are some elements nevertheless. The current strategic partners are these, 10 countries, you can all read them, there is also another list which Catherine Ashton, who is the High Representative for Foreign Policy of the European Union, has put together. Also, there are discussions of other countries as well. Turkey is not on any list, which many people see as a good sign that Turkey may eventually someday become a member of the European Union. What are the guiding principles of setting up a strategic partnership? Because there's no EU definition of a strategic partnership. Which is both good and bad. The fluidity can be used positively, but it also makes it quite a challenge for those countries who wish to engage on that basis. Well, I picked out 3 points which I want to develop a little bit from Philomena Murray, and he and Sven Liskop have written quite extensively on this in the Egmont Centre for International Studies in Brussels. And basically, Renard and others think that strategic partnerships should go beyond bilateral relations. And here we see a regional dimension, a multilateral dimension, and a values dimension as well, which I think has been under-examined in many analysis of the European Union's relationship with its interlocutors. The second is that strategic issues would be central and should be central to strategic partnerships. Here we see that the concept of security has, of course, changed over time. We had mentioned earlier about the post-2011 context. And in a sense, it's about hard security, but also about soft security, and it's about non-traditional security issues. And I think if we see it in that context, again, there are some elements of cooperation between Australia and the EU already, regardless of how the final framework agreement looks. And apparently Renard, out of his 10 points and his 10 guiding principles, suggests that strategic partnerships then grow out of cooperation on concrete issues. Now, the EU has had some problems in its relationship with Australia and Australia with the EU on the concrete issues where they have had cooperation because of the overshadowing of the relationship with the agricultural element and to a certain extent the Eurosceptic element. And indeed, even today, we still do see critiques from the Australian side of the common agricultural policy, and Ed will lend us his expertise on that. So I had to think about what is it that would make a type of EU-Australia style strategic partnership and make it work. And the first one, and I've got a few question marks here because I think we need to problematize, we need to reflect on these issues. And the first is the recognition of each other is important to each other's issues, either potential or actual. Now, here, basically, member states are part of the European Union because of the recognition that each is important to each other's interests. And I won't mention how David Cameron may see it slightly differently. But nevertheless, this interest, this common sense of interest, and again, based, if possible, on concrete achievements, as Renard talks about, I think is really important. The second is the recognition of having common concerns, but also common goals in relation to those concerns, whether in the global or the multilateral context, and whether in regional contexts. And again, I would suggest to you that we see some potential for seeing an EU-Australia style strategic partnership here. The next one is in terms of alignment of values and goals. And the European Union and Australia increasingly have been moving away from what one person I interviewed called the Cold War between Australia and the European Union when he was reflecting on the differences in climate change before Australia signed the Kyoto Protocol. He actually used the term the new Cold War between Australia and the European Union. So, but nevertheless, there are increasingly norms alignment, and the preamble, or the chapeau as it's called, to the partnership framework between Australia and the European Union of 2008 and 2009, when it was revised, does show a certain amount of that. The other is the term the habit of cooperation, which actually was used by Dahrendorf when he was referring to the European Union developing its own habits of cooperation. The term was picked up by a guy called Kevin Rudd, and he used it in fact to say the habit of cooperation of the European Union is really useful to look at, to examine in the context of an Asia-Pacific community. So strategic partnerships grow out of cooperation on concrete issues. Sure, I would agree with Renar on that. But this habit of cooperation has been quite tentative and has been quite difficult over many years. There have been examples of words being exchanged which were extremely difficult and which were extremely tense. And lastly, the close relationship with and concerns about external hegemons, China and the United States in particular. So when we look at those issues of interest, values and goals, I've already mentioned some of those now, but this is just an example, and many of these you will find in the partnership framework or other agreements. I think one of the major challenges for the EU as an interlocutor in Asia, and indeed in looking at its relationship with Australia, is what I call the triple hierarchy. That the EU has a hierarchy of policies with trade and economic issues at the top. Indeed, trade drives diplomacy, despite its normative and values elements, for much of the European Union agenda. The second is the hierarchy of interlocutors, and that is China at the very top. And the third is the hierarchy and dominance of national interests of individual member states, particularly Germany, the UK and France, in their engagement with Asia, most particularly, but not exclusively, with China. I would suggest to you that there's a sort of a triple hierarchy also on the Australian side. A hierarchy of policies with trade at the top. Does mining come to mind? A hierarchy of interlocutors, and again, China and the United States, similar interlocutors in many ways. But also a hierarchy and indeed dominance of business and security interests in terms of how Australia then relates to the Asia-Pacific region, and how it then looks at how it will deal with the relationship with Australia. As Andrea Nicolai has said, there is very much a sense of common interests and common concerns, and of course there's the Australian expertise on Asia. Maybe we have spent more money than on European studies, on Asian studies, but we do have some of the best Asianists around. So are the European Union and Australia then moving closer together? Well, there is this framework agreement. We do hope that the current issues will be solved as soon as possible. After all, we have our current Prime Minister here looking for a marriage and not an engagement. We know that building on symmetry is terribly important. This has been a neglected aspect of the relationship. The last few years have seen certainly quite a lot of an increase on that. There are shared goals beyond the bilateral relationship, and there's the possibility of what's called minilateral encounters or issues-based leadership within the Asia-Europe meeting for Australia and members of the European Union, like-minded nations. So I think the first dimension and the second dimension have been focused on policy, a single policy in a single country. Sure, there are elements of them still there, but I think there has been a move beyond those. Trade is now not the only driver of the relationship, though it remains dominant in many ways in the EU-Australia dialogue. And neither the EU nor Australia sees the other as a priority. Each of them has other countries and other regions and other areas that they see as a priority. But nevertheless, there is agreement more and more on the Asia-Pacific, on ASEM as I mentioned, and indeed in development cooperation in the Pacific. So there is now common ground. In an article I wrote with two research assistants in the past, we talked about common ground worlds apart when we looked at the European Union and Australia. I think now there is less of a burden of distance, a burden of memory and the tyranny of distance. Whether it would be better to call it a potential reliable partnership is perhaps probably more realistic than a strategic partnership. But I think that some of those elements nevertheless show that the multilateralizing and the regionalizing of the relationship have been to the benefit of both top interlocutors, and I would suggest particularly for Australia, given that it is in its own way an awkward partner in its own region, and indeed an awkward partner in some ways, even in some of its multilateral negotiations. So thank you, I'll leave it there.